Welcome to SeeMeTeach Level 6 training. In this training, we are going to look at teacher actions, the all-important teacher actions and decisions. We're going to learn how to capture data using T codes. In this training, you are going to learn the definitions of each of the 16 T codes so that you can learn to recognize and connect a teacher's action to each of the T codes. We're going to teach you this, first of all, by practicing on paper at a very slow pace, and then practicing using video at a slow pace, and finally developing more speed and accuracy so that you can keep up with the sometimes fast pace of instruction in the classroom. Let's say a little bit about why we keep track of teacher actions. We all know that teachers are key to learning. If students show up to class, then it is the teacher that is the most crucial factor that affects learning. Every child deserves a world-class teacher, and even the best teachers realize that they can fine-tune their teaching or continue to grow as a teacher to have even more of a positive impact on learning in their classroom. Now, when we watch teachers, we know they make hundreds of decisions that result in hundreds of actions during a single lesson. Even seemingly trivial decisions can have a huge impact on learning or impede the efforts of the teacher to achieve a robust learning environment. Therefore, it is really important that the observers can recognize discrete actions a teacher makes or takes when teaching. These actions combine to form patterns and tendencies that can be modified to create the interactions with students that result in an even more positive learning environment. Let's take a look at these T codes and teach them to you in chunks. So the first chunk are the first three. T0 is the teacher monitoring the classroom or doing administrative work like taking attendance. T1 is the teacher presenting information such as lecturing, and T2 is the teacher giving direction. The second chunk are the types of questions, the categories that we put questions into. So T3A is when teachers ask a yes/no question. T3B is a short answer or recall type of question. A T4A is when the teacher asks a higher level question that requires the student to speculate or to think at a higher level than recall. A T4B is when the teacher asks a T4A type question, but in addition asks the student to provide their reasons or justification for their answer. The third chunk of codes contains 8 codes, and these codes all pertain to what teachers do following a student response. And we'll go through them quickly. So T5 is when the teacher rejects a student's answer. It clearly tells the student they're wrong. T6 is when they acknowledge a student answer, and that is an acknowledgement, not right, not wrong, but they tell the student they heard them. T7 is when they confirm an answer. The student clearly knows that they got the answer correct. T8 is when teachers repeat a student answer. T9 is when the teacher clarifies or adds on to the student answer. T10 is when the teacher answers a student question. T11 is when the teacher asks that student to clarify. A student gives an answer and the teacher says, "Could you tell me more?" And T12 is when the teacher uses a student idea with the rest of the class in order to get students to react to each other's ideas. So now I'm going to teach you how to remember the codes, the T codes, very easily using images and mnemonics. So a T0 is used and coded when a teacher is not actively teaching the students. She or he may be doing paperwork, might be taking attendance, might be grading papers, might be just simply standing there and overseeing and monitoring the students, watching the students work, but they are not actively teaching or interacting with students at the moment. So think of the T0 and the 0 as there's zero teaching going on in terms of interacting with students. So T1 is very easy. Just picture a person standing straight in the front of the room talking to the students. One is lecturing or talking to the students. The person standing straight up. Just visualize that in your head as a number 1. And you will remember that number 1 is lecturing or talking to students. A T2 is used to note when the teacher is giving directions to either individuals or the whole class. So picture this signpost with the signs on it and the number 2 on that signpost. Visualize that in your head and remember that a 2 is for giving directions. Now let's take a look at the question types. First of all, there's only 4 question types used in this coding system. I know there's other ways of categorizing questions, but sometimes you have so many categories. If you try to use them with a teacher observation, by the time you figure out which category it is in, there are many, many actions that have gone by that if you have not coded. We use a simple system taken from something called the SATIC coding system, SATIC, something put together many, many years ago. And there's 4 question types. The first one is T3A. And it is simply a yes-no question, a question that is asked in a yes-no manner. Now, don't make the mistake of coding these questions as you think the teacher intended. Code them as they are asked. So anytime a question comes up and starts with a would you, could you, are you, will you, those are yes-no type questions, and code them as such, a T3A. Then we have short answer, or what we call recall questions. These are usually factual type questions. When was the War of 1812? Is this red or blue? Now those are pretty simply asked questions, but anything that's a short answer or a recall, a fact type of question, we would categorize as a T3B. Now T4A and T4B are what we call higher level questions in this system. So T4A is a question that is asked that requires deeper thinking than recall, perhaps speculation on the student's part. So if we start out with a question that goes, what might be the reasons for? That would be a T4A. Or what do you think might happen if? Or how do the author's writing styles compare in terms of being similar or different? When you're asking students to compare and contrast, that certainly is a deeper thinking question. Now, how does a T4A differ from a T4B? A T4A is much like a T4B, except a T4B requires deeper thinking and perhaps speculation, but you also ask for justification or an explanation of their thinking. So I could ask the question, what might be the reasons for ... and tell me why you think so. In other words, explain your thinking to me. Or which one do you think will get to the bottom of the hill first? The heavier one? The lighter one? And tell me why you think so. It requires speculation. It requires justification of their thinking. So that would make it a T4B. So again, we only have 4 question types. And there's other examples in your training manual. I would suggest you review those and make sure you're clear as to which of the 4 categories a question type might fall into. T5 through T12. And these are codes that represent what teachers do after a student has responded to a question or after a student action of some type. Let's start out with T5. So T5 is when the teacher rejects a student answer, or a comment or a question. It's clearly telling the student that they are wrong, that they are incorrect. And there's a number of ways of letting students know that by what we say. We could say, no, that's not correct. Or sometimes we say, well, could someone help him out? Or sometimes we react to a student answer by saying, well, not quite. How about someone else? We've clearly told them that they are not correct. So how do we easily remember that T5 is reject or telling the student that they are wrong? Well, think of this lawman with the 5 on his chest or the 5-pointed star, or the lawman comes to you when you're wrong. So number 5, T5, is reject or telling the student they are wrong. A T6 is acknowledging a student response. Now, when we say acknowledging, we mean we are not confirming or rejecting. We're telling the student that we heard their answer and maybe that we understand their answer. We might acknowledge by saying, I see, or we might say something like, well, that's an interesting answer. Or, okay, hey, thanks for sharing. Or we might say, I think I understand what you are saying. Or we might use a combination of those. How do we remember that T6 is acknowledging but not confirming and not rejecting? Remember, rejecting is number 5 and confirming is going to be number 7. So how do we remember that? Well, it's halfway in between. It's the neutral ground. It's in the middle of 5 and 7. So it is acknowledging. Now, T7 is simply letting the student know that they are correct. And we do that in a variety of ways. We might say, yes, that is correct, or right. There's many ways of doing that, but it is simply saying to the student, yes, your answer was indeed correct. How do we use mnemonics to help us remember that number 7 is telling the student that they are correct? Well, think of 7 as hitting the jackpot. The student gives us an answer that hits the jackpot. Yay! Number 7 is correct. You hit the jackpot. T8 is repeating what the student has said. And how do we remember that? Well, we start out by thinking of first of all, a 0 or an O. If we repeat that mark and make 2 of them, and then we turn it, it becomes an 8. So 2 zeros repeated become an 8, and that's what 8 is. It's repeating what the student has said to us. Now, T9 is when the teacher clarifies for the student and adds more information to the student answer or to the student response. So the teacher might say, and I'm just being facetious here, the teacher might say something like, well, what's the meaning of life? And the student says 42. And the teacher goes, yes, 42, because, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's a T9. The teacher adds way more information beyond the student answer and sort of clarifies the student answer for the class or for the student, much more information than the student ever indicated. And we often do that as teachers, but if we say to the student, well, do you think that when you combine the 2 wires, the current is going to be more or less? And the student says more. And we go, yes, right, more. Because when you combine the 2 wires, you increase the blah, blah, blah. And when we do that, it is the teacher doing the thinking and doing the explaining rather than asking the student to explain their answer. Because that student may have guessed, they may have just thrown out a random word, and we actually learn less from students when we do the clarifying or thinking for the student. So you're probably asking at this point, what's with that B with the long stinger? Well, I think of that as my mnemonic to help me remember that number 9 is the teacher injecting a whole lot more information into what the student said and adding on to it. So that's my mnemonic. My B adding in a whole bunch more information with the shape of the B and the stinger looking like a 9. Now, T10 is when the teacher answers a student question. The student has posed a question to the teacher, and the teacher simply is answering the question. That is a T10. Now, we remember that by a T10 is, well, who knows everything? Well, it's the teacher, and their answers are always 10s, right? Always correct. So they are 10s. T10 is teacher answering a question. Now, a T11 is when the teacher asks the student to clarify their own answer, to tell us more about their answer. And this is a good way to get at student thinking. Sometimes students will give us one word or short answers, and they know and think a whole lot more. And if we ask them to tell us more, they will tell us, and it will give us great insights into their thinking, their reasons, their explanations, their wild and crazy thoughts they have. So how do we remember that T11 is asking a student to clarify? Well, first of all, we ask a question and we get a response from that first student, that first one. And then we go right back to that student, that second one, that second number 1, and we stay with that same student. So a response from number 1 and a response from number 1 again. So T11 is asking a single student to clarify. A T12 is when we ask other students in class to react to the first student's idea. So we get a student response, and then we say to the rest of the class, something like this. So Joe said he thought it might go faster. How does your prediction compare to Joe's? And we're asking that to the rest of the whole class, perhaps. Or Joe said that we need to add some more weight to get the car to go faster down the hill. Let's play with that prediction for a bit. Why might it go faster as Joe predicts? And again, we're asking and we're looking at the rest of the class. So a T12 is taking a student's idea and playing with it and using it and asking the rest of the class to react to it. So how can we easily remember that T12 is taking a student's idea and using it with the rest of the class? Well, just like T11 was a 1 and a 1, where we got an answer from a single student, and we went right back to that single student for clarification. T12 is a 1 and a 2, so we take the single student's idea, and then we bounce it off to the rest of the class, which the 2 represents, another student in the class or the rest of the class. So T12 is using a student's idea with the rest of the class. A T13 code is used whenever the teacher is displaying some either nonverbal or verbal annoying behaviors. And T13 is one of those things, it just counts. It's not an event and timing code. It just counts and notes that it happened, and it happened at this time on the clock, but the length of time is not noted. So some of those examples are, teachers might say, to the point where students, that's all they're thinking about and counting the number of times the teacher says, Or the teacher might have their arms folded across their chest or closed off in some manner, and it becomes kind of an annoying habit, much like people with beards, men with beards oftentimes stroke their beard, unknowingly perhaps, and it becomes kind of an annoying nonverbal behavior. It's anything that students might make note of that takes their attention off of the lesson and something that we think the teacher should be aware of, so we code it as a T13 and we note that it happened, and at the end we can look at, well, how many times did they actually do that? We might say, you said 45 times during this lesson. Is that something you want to continue doing, or is that something you think you might change? Okay, so how do we remember that T13 are those unwanted verbal or nonverbal mannerisms? So think of unlucky number 13, unwanted, unlucky number 13, some things that we don't want to see. Now that you have a much better idea of the T codes and what they represent, we're going to ask you to complete a couple sets of practice worksheets that are found in the appendices in the section called Learning the T Codes. These will give you some practice identifying things that teachers say and do and coding it with the appropriate T code. When you're finished, check your answers against the practice sheet keys. Then, if you feel like you need more practice recognizing examples of the T codes, well, perhaps write your own set of teacher and student interactions using all the T codes during the interaction. When you're done, continue to watch this video to learn how to use SeeMeTeach to collect the T codes. In the next video overview, Part B, you will learn how to view the quantitative analysis of the T code data so you can discern the fundamental and significant indicators of effective instruction in order to use data for reflecting on instruction or for feedback and coaching purposes. Okay, now let's take a quick look at how you collect T code data in a quantitative data collection mode. Let's remind you how to start an observation. We're going to use video. I have the URL I'm going to paste in. I'm going to choose myself as a teacher, and I want to save and continue because I'm going to create a seating chart again. I know that if I click on student, it turns blue. I can put my numbers in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because I'm teaching the avatar students again. And I can save and start, and I can do the quantitative start the observation. There's my video, there's my play and pause buttons, there's my clock, here's my seating chart, as you are well aware of at this point. But I'm going to demonstrate how we do this for a short amount of time, and then you will, with your skills, go through it at the pace that you can and collect your own data. Following that, I'm going to show you how to do the T code analysis. So we're going to hit done when we're finished, and that'll take us directly to the T code analysis. So knowing that the volume of my video will overshadow my voice, let's just watch it for a while and you can see how I code this lesson using T codes. So now I'm going to show you a little segment of me collecting T code only data. Remember that the rule number 1 is you press play and then you press your L code. And rule number 2 is you press these teacher code buttons or the S code buttons at the end of the event, at the end of the action. So when the teacher finishes asking a question, you would press the appropriate T code button for that. So let's play and watch me code for a little bit, and know that the voice of me teaching is going to overwhelm my narrator voice. So I won't say anything while I am coding. You can watch and listen. And since we are only learning the T codes, I'm going to cover up the rest of the button. You don't have to pay any attention to those. You're just looking at the T codes. So think about the because part of that. I think metal boats float because, and again, I'm just looking for your best guesses. You know, your best guess as to why this might work that way. All right, so I see Sean's hand up, and let me give you a few more seconds here of think time. I think metal boats float because.
Well, I mean, metal boats float because I'm not really sure why. Because now that we're talking about density and weight and stuff, I mean, I guess I'm kind of like thinking, well, how do they float? Because it's metal and it's more dense, but why isn't it sinking? So I mean, honestly, I'm trying to come up with an answer. So I'm not. That's a good question.
Hey, you know what? Thank you for your honest response, because this is a hard thing. This is not an easy thing to think about, and the nice thing is I can see you wrestling with it in your mind. So thank you for that answer. CJ, you've always got some interesting answers. I think metal boats float because.
Because they have air inside.
They have air inside. Okay, that's also an interesting answer. Very, very interesting thinking, CJ. And let's jump up to Ed. Ed, what I think metal boats float because.
Well, I kind of agree, sort of with CJ, but my thinking was it's because of the way they're built.
Because of the way they're built. So
yeah.
That's a really interesting answer too. Tell me just a little bit more about what you mean by the way they're built.
Well, it kind of makes sense that if you have something that's dense, but if it's hollow, then maybe that will keep it from sinking.
Oh, I see. So if it's hollow, so it's built so it's hollow.
Yeah.
I see. All right. And Sean, what would your answer be?
I mean, that was kind of what I was thinking too. That's like if you build a boat that's enclosed like like a submarine or an aircraft carrier, it's kind of like a balloon. So
Like
it would kind of float.
Okay. Now a balloon is completely enclosed with trapped air.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you saying to me, or not maybe, are you saying that the boat is somehow completely enclosed with trapped air?
Well, if you have a submarine, it is. And submarines can float, but they can also go underwater.
I see. But so submarines can float, but they come up to the surface and they open up the hatch.
Yeah.
And now that air isn't trapped anymore. Do they sink right away when they open the hatch or not?
No.
No. So here we have kind of a perplexing situation, don't we, right? And
yeah.
Lastly, Maria, how would you respond to that statement, that sentence? I think metal boats float because.
I think it probably has something to do with the way they're built.
The way they're built, again, somewhat like what Ed said. Could you tell me a little bit more about why you think the way they're, or what it means, the way they're built?
Well, I'm not really an expert in seacraft, but I think it's probably a combination of materials you use and construction. Okay, so in this short episode, you see me asking the same question to multiple students, a question that requires speculation about why things might float or why things sink. And what you saw me also doing was I tended to acknowledge the student answers by saying, I see, or that's interesting. I wasn't telling them whether they were right or wrong. I was saying, basically, I've heard you. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I see. I often also repeated their answer a little bit. I may have repeated part of what they said and then said, oh, I see, that's interesting.
And then the fourth thing you saw me do was asking students to clarify. So once I got a student response, I may have repeated, acknowledged, and then I may have said, well, can you tell me more about what you were thinking? Give me more to your answer, something like that. So that's what you tended to see me do in this short clip. And I would guess, since everybody has a fingerprint, including me, that throughout much of the rest of this lesson, you're going to find that that is my teaching fingerprint. And when we get to the lesson analysis, the T-code lesson analysis, and we look at all the codes and we look for patterns and tendencies, you're probably going to find that when we get to the T-code analysis. So this is just a short sample of coding. Notice that if you're only coding the T-codes, it's really not too terribly difficult to code once you understand what each code represents and where it is. At times you saw me staging because I knew what I tended to do, and you will know this when you watch somebody else, what they tend to do. After student answers, you know they tend to either confirm or reject or acknowledge or repeat. And you find the cursor, you're staging there, ready to click on one of those because you know that's what they tend to do. And that's what I was doing when you saw me coding. Now, the next step for you is to load up a lesson with the float sync activity and code that lesson using only the T codes this time, so you become more familiar with and develop some greater speed with regard to coding the T codes. So go ahead and do that now, and when you're done, we'll take a look at the T code analysis mode and look at how these codes came through in terms of percentages and some of our interaction patterns and so on. So go ahead and code the floating and syncing video now.